Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special, looking at the Africa mining outlook for 2017. I'm Kukulethu Cele. Africa contains an estimated 30% of the world's mineral resources. Natural resources have accounted for about 35% of Africa's growth since 2000. Nonetheless, international investors and mining companies remain cautious owing to Africa's never-ending challenges, including a lack of infrastructure, power, and commodity price volatility. On the show today, we'll be unpacking the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for this sector in 2017. Joining me to unpack some of the key issues that are at hand are an esteemed panel of experts: Shirley Weber, who's coverage head of natural resources at Barclays Africa; Mamokgethi Molopyane, who's mining and labor analyst at Creative Voodoo Consulting; and Wandisile Manglana, partner at Bowman's. Welcome to each of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Just as an overview of the mining fraternity, as mentioned in the introduction, there's no doubt as to how critical and key this particular sector is for economic development and performance for many African states. But before we actually look forward to what the year ahead holds, let's paint a picture of the last 2 years and the current operating environment within which we're in. Shirley, it hasn't been an early ride.
No.
An easy ride, excuse me.
No, it wasn't at all. 2016 was a very difficult year. We've seen so many of the commodity prices being very volatile that clearly impacted many companies' profitabilities. And together with that, we see, for example, we believe that there's a more optimistic view going forward in 2017. The exchange rate volatility, the dollar-ZAR specifically, had a very big impact, and in many cases positively, on many of the mining companies and their profitability.
We've also seen a lot of mining companies positioning themselves in order to weather the storm last year. Significant divestment, cost-cutting controls, debt management structures, which for some companies have reaped some rewards, if you look at mining results like Harmony Gold published just yesterday. But the question is, are they fit for the long term now?
I've seen many of the clients that we deal with, specifically from Barclays Africa point of view, South Africa and in Africa where they have the operations, that there was a definite focus on cost cutting and making sure that efficiency is actually in the various operations. So I believe many of the large miners that we deal with have actually done their dues, and they have dramatically changed the way they look at their business. So together with managing exchange rates and commodity prices that they have to look out for, we've seen efficiencies happening.
All external controls, many of which we don't have control over. But Mamokgethi, you've been a popular and often attendee of the Mining Indaba, which is set to kick off in the next coming days. And we've always heard the narrative that this is a sunset industry. Now, you speak to the chief executives, you speak to the leaders themselves, and investors as well, and they disagree. What's your view?
Indeed, thank you for having me. One of the key points we are seeing emerging from South Africa's mining perspective is that it continues to be a significant contributor to the economy. It might no longer be the industry that is seen as the biggest employer to the biggest contributor to GDP. However, it remains significant. And by that, I mean 15% of foreign direct investment in South Africa comes from mining, and 10% of it is mostly here at home in South Africa. So it remains a critical sector, and it's cyclical, as we know. It has its ups and downs. There are times when, like last year, Shirley had said, most of the companies were restructuring, impacted by China, as China was rebalancing its economy because growth was slow. So in the context of that, we are now going to see a mining industry that probably is coming out of the worst downward trend in a while. I mean, last year was the worst sessions they had. And so there is optimism moving forward. And for South Africa, however, in terms of its significance to the economy, it remains relevant because of the multiplier effect of the jobs it creates.
You talk about us coming out of this deep cycle, which certainly took us as a significant shock over the last 2 years. But the question is, does the future look incredibly optimistic? Could we see that super commodity price cycle boom that South Africa and many commentators actually say we might have missed out on? And Wandisile, you can come in and give us your views here too. But Mamokgethi, your thoughts first?
It might. I mean, when you look at how the industry performs over the years. There are dips and then there is an increase. So performance will always vary over the years. We have seen the super cycle that was there, and we have seen the number of investments that were made in the industry globally, but more significantly in Africa and in SADC countries too. However, it is still, for me, critical that we maintain an optimistic look. I mean, when you look at the World Bank report on the commodities that was released at the beginning of the year, they are saying, well, mining has been so down. The only way it can't go further down, and it will come up perhaps. So for me, that is a positive note, in the sense that perhaps finally at 2017, we are going to begin to see a slow climb. It might not be significant, but we will be climbing out of the abyss that the industry was in. Wandisile?
Definitely. The mining industry still has a future in South Africa. That's clearly evident from the project pipelines from various companies we're advising them. You see, they still have those long life of mine plans, and they still have new projects in development. We see a couple of new mines entering the space, applying for various prospecting rights, and even those. So while you may see some of the bigs or the majors disposing, but you do see them holding on to some of their lucrative assets, and when you look into their long-term future, you realize those they're keeping still has a future, and probably are diversifying or are selling off these other assets solely on the basis of ensuring they remain sustainable. And even from a regulatory perspective, a clear indication that there is still future for the mining industry in South Africa. Though uncertain and though incomplete, you do see a lot of initiatives aimed at making or streamlining the mining regulatory environment so that it is able to serve the mining industry in the future. Whether it sufficiently does at the moment, it's open for debate.
Let's discuss that in more detail, and I'm hoping that maybe we can take a look at the policy and legislative environment, talk towards the capital and obviously operational efficiencies, which includes the human capital, which is a key element to mining investment and operations. From a legal perspective, Wandisile, we've naturally had a lot of issues with regard, and challenges rather, between the private sector and government with regard to policy, appropriate implementation. Where are we getting it wrong in the South African context of things, and are there examples that we can look to that are positive from the rest of the continent?
Exactly. I think, as you're saying, pointed out, where we probably for a long time, where we've been getting wrong, not necessarily wrong, where there have been some misalignments, is at getting clearly what's not working and then trying to find an appropriate legal solution to it. There's a number of examples one can point out to. For a very long time, it is known that there are issues regarding communities living close to mining areas. There is a legal regime seeking to do that. Mining industries or mining companies are required to have SLPs in place, and what we tend to have in some instances is each mine in one geographical area having its own SLP and not integrated to any of the planning instruments, not of their own failure, either just because the obligation is imposed on each mining and there isn't any central coordinating body where government could play a role to enhance and consolidate all those efforts through that regulatory instrument. Then therefore, whilst you may have an obligation, a legal regime, a legal obligation imposed on a holder to implement certain social, economic obligations, you don't have a coordinated effort to ensure that those are put into one together. So what I'm basically saying is, whilst we have the regime, from an implementation level, we don't seem to be talking.
Just very briefly on that, have mining companies done enough? Because you look at examples and studies that have been released regarding the human rights crisis that we see around mines that close, like Blyvoor.
I think then the question becomes, what is enough? I think where I am and looking at the clients we are advising, they really take serious their obligations. They do take effort to implement all their obligations. Whether sufficient or not, and what more can be done, I think it's open for debate, but I think their obligations, they do take them seriously.
Indeed, and if I may come in, because he had said it's open for debate, therefore I shall engage the issue. When one of the key aspects for me that stands out in terms of policy and regulatory framework in South African mining context is that we have seen for the past 5 years years, and under the current Mineral Resources Ministry, a lot of changing in policies and a lot of augmentation of policy. Therefore, as Ndade Wandisile would say, their clients who are the private sector of mining are arguing and saying, look, government, you cannot chop and change policies as you come and go, because it takes away the certainty. And government, on the other hand, as the principle of mining policy regulatory framework is saying, well, we are chopping and changing because your client, you as the private sector have not done enough in terms of one, the work that is supposed to go in your SLPs, in the communities that are hosting you as mine hosting communities. Two, in terms of aspects such as beneficiation, in terms of an aspect that is now quite debatable and is probably going to go to the courts, which is once empowered, always empowered. So that remains the challenge with South Africa's mining policy at the policy level, but also at the legislature level. We are seeing the clashing of heads, so to speak, with the private sector of mining and with the policymakers, which is the state, in how mining policy must unfold. And sadly, as I always, whether I write or say on radio, sadly, the investment in mining cannot wait for South Africa to sort out its policies. They will go somewhere, they will go to other African countries. Example, Botswana is perceived as having the most advanced and perhaps the most clear regulations in terms of mining. So for me, what would be significant in South Africa's mining outlook as investment expands further into the continent is, how do we sort out our policy in such a way that investors do no longer say, hang on, I'll hang on to my money while they finish their internal squabbles. That is significant in taking the industry forward.
I can maybe just add to that, if you don't mind, Kuguletu. From our side, when we fund any type of project, if it's in South Africa or in Africa, we've seen many of the private mining companies obviously doing a lot, for the environment, because that's clearly a condition, for the banks as well, giving out funding, that the environmental aspects and the Equator principles have been adhered to. A second thing that we also check is to make sure that if there were communities around the area, and especially if it's a greenfields mine, that something is done properly, to move communities to a proper area. And I mean, we financed, for example, a specific mine in Lesotho, where it was more greenfields than anything else, and there were a whole lot of effort done in moving communities to a place and make sure that there's buy-in, water, housing, etc. So you always get those exceptions of mining companies doing a lot. When we do funding as well, the question, like Mokgitsi mentioned, once empowered, always empowered, that's part of the things that we also need to look at, because we want to be seen to adhere to all the rules and regulations that's out in a country. And that is a very great point, that we have to manage as well when we allocate funding to certain projects.
Is there a perfect balance that we need to strike here? Because again, as you've all alluded to, there's a very the strong correlation, between policy as well as level of investment, and those go hand in hand. But at the same time, for capital and private investors, surely they need to make a return on their investment. How do you measure that, whilst at the same time investing appropriately in the people, in the environment, and having capital with a conscience, but also not leading to environments where you present a quasi-state, where everything is dependent on you without any assistance from the governments that are there? An open question to any of you.
Well, for me, what would be significant perhaps is we see both role players come together and say, okay, to move the industry forward, we might squabble about this and that, but let us have one or two significant policies clarified and finalized. And that hasn't happened. When you listen to the minister at the beginning of last year's Mining Indaba, he said, Minister Zwane, we will be finalizing the mining charter. That was last year. The mining charter is still open. It is still being looked at, it's still being changed, it's still being augmented, it's still being finalized. Equally so, the Mineral Resources and Petroleum Act, MPRDA, it is still again open for engagement, and it is still being debated and going to and fro from Parliament. For me,
capital doesn't like that, right? Yes. The uncertainty in the market.
And for me, that is significant. If perhaps those true aspects of our mining policy can be clarified, and we can whittle out the nitty-gritty details later, while we have, as South Africa, clarified that and finalized that, perhaps then it will move South Africa mining out of the dilemma it is in. It is in an abyss compared to the rest of the continent. Investors, Shoseli will say, are looking outside South Africa through to the rest of the continent. So we need perhaps to sort that out in the South African context for me. And my final point perhaps on this matter, Shirley touched on the Greenfields projects when they're investing in it. Indeed, and perhaps Sir can help us with that. If indeed mining companies in the terms of the human aspect are doing so much in terms of empowering communities, why has in the past 4 years investment in greenfields moved from $50 billion to now about $20 billion? If they are doing something significant in that aspect, why has investment so become down, and why has it drastically been reduced? One of the challenges that South Africa again faces that mine hosting communities are saying, you are not developing us enough. Of course, it's not the responsibility of mining companies. It can be a joint partnership between mining companies and local government. But 20 years later, it must be clear, what do mine hosting communities have to show in terms of having hosted multinationals?
Couldn't agree with you more. Indeed, more must be done. Hosting companies, hosting communities, in fact, the entire community must benefit well. And I'm not necessarily saying they've done all that should be done. They are doing all the best they can be done under the circumstances. There is indeed a need to strike a balance and have a clear dialogue between government and the industry. And I think both government and the industry recognizes that need. It's evident in various speeches that's made and done by them. What needs to be taken is a step further, which is a further point that we have made, Mamkheti, regarding that we need now to get to a point whereby those outstanding pieces of legislation need to be completed and finalized to provide some greater certainty, so that if there remains any further regulatory gaps there, we identify from that basis. Whereas now we've got a backlog, we're still looking where we are, the gaps that we currently have, and not moving forward. I am indeed looking forward to a time when the MPRDA amendment bill is completed. It will probably it won't address all the issues, we already know that, but it would go some way in addressing the issue.
An unfair question to you, Wandisile, but in a perfect world, the MPRDA, the mining charter, and other regulatory issues which are at loggerheads between the private sector and government, what would the ideal and perfect outcomes from a policy and regulatory perspective be to suit all parties involved?
From a policy and regulatory, I think again it's a negotiated outcome. Basically, that would be an ideal. Industry is putting points ahead. Government is putting points ahead. It doesn't look like at the moment everyone is finding each other. There is validity, quite honestly, on both sides, on both points. Everyone accepts. What then needs to be agreed on is the mechanism to achieve that ideal. And I think if we realize, maybe to some credit to the DMR regarding the mine charter, we all know they published it in April in all haste, saying it will be done in June. Realizing the outcry, they postponed. I don't know whether they listened sufficiently to the industry, but indications are not. They say December. Again, now we see it's being postponed too much. And we understand part of these postponements are due to negotiation, especially with the chamber. We hope then, if it is a negotiated outcome, it will be better. We all know Mining Charter 1 was an outcome of a negotiated outcome. It was widely embraced by everyone, as opposed to Mining Charter 2 and Mining Charter 3, which seem to be a little bit unilateral. So there is so much value in a negotiated outcome.
Ongoing conversations which certainly do need to take place. I wanted to touch on the capital outcome now and your experiences across the continent. You've alluded to Botswana, and we've also have a few estimates with regard to commodity prices. I understand copper might still find itself under pressure. Precious metals have certainly gotten a boost from Trump, not only tweeting the right things, but saying the right things as well at certain times. But of course, there are concerns with regard to base metals, given that demand from China has been offset, as Mamkheti alluded to, with the rebasing the foundation of economic growth and development in that economy. What does that mean for you as Barclays Africa when it comes to investment opportunities on operations and mining opportunities and commodities that you might be bullish on?
When we look at the various countries, obviously there are countries like in India and China that takes a whole lot of our commodities out of not just South Africa but also out of Africa. We've seen there's been definitely a slow, a slower pace in the demand, but we don't see that keeping, a slower pace for forever. So we believe, it would stabilize at a certain level, and slowly but surely, because of, for example, on the precious metal side, India has curbed a lot of the activity because of them wanting to ensure, that they obviously manage from a not just from a political point of view, but maybe to ensure that there's no corruption, etc., in the specific gold market, that they obviously have moved imports down a little bit, but that won't continue. If you look at base metals, and let's talk about iron ore and all of those things, look at where the prices are of iron ore. I mean, nobody expected iron ore to be where it is, during the last few months. So we do believe that gold is a very important indicator for precious metals in general. It's been volatile. We see it softening a little bit. But clearly we've got a big website where we can look at all these forecast prices. But our view on gold, that's the softening of that. We've seen diamonds, and especially in Botswana and obviously in South Africa as well, where there's the diamonds of Africa mostly, is that there's a softening in prices. But a lot of activity in diamonds. So we're very positive about that specific industry right through the value chain. And that obviously includes the beneficiation that Mamokgethi also mentioned. So very positive actually about the 2017 outlook.
And for me, what stands out perhaps, as you had said, besides tweeting crazy stuff, Donald Trump, perhaps what stands out for me is that copper, we expect to see copper price rise up quite significantly, bolstered, interestingly enough, by Trump's presidency. And when we look at what the price of copper was, it's around 5,300 per ton, and predictions are that it will perhaps rise up to being about 6,200 per ton. So that, for me, is going to be, if that happens, it is perhaps going to be the significant climber of commodities, of a single commodity, perhaps in the outlook for 2017. And for African countries that are producers of copper, that is perhaps a good news.
Top of mind, I'm thinking Zambia and the DRC are obviously well positioned for that. Are we seeing any kind of activity from Barclays and any of your clients, Wandisile, who again are bullish and reacting to these estimates when it comes to prices? Definitely. And maybe moving further into those markets?
From our side, definitely. I mean, Zambia is a very big market for us. I mean, we've got a very good setup in Zambia from a Barclays Africa point of view.
from the nationalization in its purest form. What we're starting to see is various forms of, not necessarily nationalization, there are various forms that could effect to some elements of nationalization. Examples of those is one example that we've already spoken to. Various countries across the continent where we're advising are starting to emphasize the need for local beneficiation. Some of them are looking for some of the companies to have some listing in their local jurisdictions as a way of ensuring they plow back, and in some instances we're seeing greater demand for local content, especially in the labor aspects of it, that certain portions so that people don't import their labor into a particular country. So we're seeing a spread of
I don't think anyone minds regulations, but if it's uncertain and it changes from day to day, that becomes a problem. And African countries as well, we've seen a lot of investments being stopped because of those two aspects that is not there. Regulatory certainty, very important for any mining investment.
Indeed. Let's certainly hope that we find that pace of equilibrium going forward. We're going to take a quick ad break, but when we return, we continue with our discussion regarding the outlook for mining in 2017, unpacking some of the thoughts that might be shared at the Mining Indaba, and of course, the human element in all of this. Where does labor slot into the investment dynamics in mining? That and more right after the break. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special on Africa's mining outlook for 2017. Still with me in studio, I have Shirley Webber, coverage head of natural resources at Barclays Africa, Wandisile Madlana, who's a partner in mining and environmental law at Bowman's, and Mamokgethi Molopean, who's mining and labor analyst at Creative Voodoo Consulting. Again, earlier on, just before the ad break, we had focused a lot on the legal perspective, how capital is influenced by some of these dynamics, and of course the pressures that we face both internally from a political perspective in South Africa and some of the opportunities across the continent. But it all comes down to people doing this job, and in the African context and South Africa specifically, with deep level mining, it's incredibly labor intensive. I'd like to start with you, Mamokgethi, taking advantage of the fact that you've alluded to the human element being tabled at the Mining Indaba, and that's an element that you would like to see being highlighted this year.
Indeed, it's critical for perhaps South Africa and the continent to not always be seen as a continent that gives out its resources, or investment only is put in when there is something to take out. And over the years, I mean, last year in many of the breakaway sessions at the Indaba, over the years for me, what has become critical is, even though it's an investment conference, it's critical that it brings up the human element of it. And by that I mean investment in labor. Often when you listen to the sessions that are in breakaway rooms or the conference, the theme of the conference itself, it never really highlights in detail what it is going to be doing in the social aspects of it. Usually either the social aspects are broken down into smaller rooms far away from the bigger main plenary sessions. And for me, I think it's critical that we look back at that, because Shirley knows that investment doesn't function in silo. So you can have money to invest, but if you do not have workers to produce the commodities that you're looking for, you become redundant and irrelevant. So for Africa's mining, and it's something perhaps that I'm keen to see at the 2017 mining outlook, is for African ministers to say it's not just about bringing money and taking resources, but also it's about developing, not living near, I call them mine hosting communities, because mining companies found them there. It is where they were. They came and hosted them. So we would like to see them do much more about integrating into local economic development. And I think this conference is as equally critical at a higher policy-making level for ministers. It is, for me, equally critical for mine hosting communities, and equally critical for local municipalities to be there, because they are the drivers of development in those communities. So I would like to see less protest outside the main hall of the convention center, because communities are saying you are not listening to us. And for those who have put this conference together, invite those communities in to say, how is it that our investment can augment and better your lives? But above all, how is it that our investment can, when we have finished mining, ensure that we have left programs that are going to function beyond mining activities?
Go ahead.
Yes. I fully agree. The investment on people should really take center stage, especially in this Mining Indaba, and especially if one has regard to the fact that there's all sorts of retrenchments at the moment. So we really need to ensure that they, to the extent they can't be avoided, they are done in the most humanly possible way, and with a view of accommodating people in other aspects of the business if possible. Just from, again, speaking like a lawyer, there's always a law about everything. The MPRD, I think, is one of the beauties that it has. When you're approaching closure, there are all sorts of obligation imposed on the holder of a mine on how it should go about. It creates all sorts of arrangements of consultation with the employees, with the government, and all of that. If those forums could be used appropriately, I think we can achieve something, especially in the South African context. But up to now, yes, it hasn't been done properly, because of sometimes that when we get there, everyone is no longer interested to speak, everyone is imposing obligations. But I think moving forward, we really need to find a way of implementing those provisions insofar as they are inadequate, find alternative ways of speaking to each other regarding retrenchments, because they affect people and their families.
What could some of those alternatives be? Because so often we hear of references being made to the Australian mining fraternity, and the operating environment there is completely different to what we have here in South Africa. So what would be different? You have NEDLAC, you have these tables at which individuals negotiate with from a multi-stakeholder perspective, but unfortunately there's always a consistent deadlock.
There's always consistent deadlock because, again, I think most parties negotiate from a position interest. They look at their own interest. So you would find government only protecting its interest, industry protecting its interest, and employees looking at their own interest. But if we really look at it and negotiating properly, I think we can find solutions. Some of the provisions, as I say, and if everyone takes it to heart and do it properly, I think some of those provisions can achieve something. For example, we have seen recently, whether it's sustainable or not, there's been mining companies that were proposing to retrench an X number of employees because of a recent merger between two operations. Following a dialogue, those retrenchments were avoided and people were placed in other operations, other parts of the business, because there was a proper negotiation, and part of the agreement was in respect of reskilling those employees so that they can be better suitable to other businesses. And the MPRDA, as part of your social labor plan, already provides for that requirement. What is unfortunate is we almost wait until we're at the close level, as opposed that if you know we will be closing, you can start reskilling your employees so that they can be better deployed elsewhere, as opposed to reacting a month or two before, or a year or two before closure.
Exactly.
Which is why then this causes problems.
But if I may come in also, he has made very key points. And for me, an example would be in the South African context, where we have possibly the world's largest reserves of platinum, and where platinum still continues to be a significant player in mining industry. Platinum, before it becomes the final product, goes through different phases of it before it becomes product. So instead of just mining it here, it is perhaps critical for South African operations of multinational to say, we are not only going to be mining here, but of the 6 phases that platinum goes through, and only one happens in South Africa or Africa, which is extracting of it. Perhaps we will put 2 more phases within that mine hosting community, or within the town of that mining hosting communities, where to allow infrastructure. For example, outside in Rustenburg, at the platinum belt in the northwest, in an area called Mohwase, it used to have factories. So those factories could be refurbished and open up again, and perhaps a certain aspect of platinum production can go into it, not just mining. And that fits into the broader picture of a local economic development, because local economy saying you cannot just only take out resources, you must empower the communities, but also in your empowering the communities, or the communities hosting you, you must come up with projects that are not mine orientated only. So it can move from mining platinum to a factory perhaps that cleans it out, and so it becomes a functional factory that can catch those workers that are going to be retrenched from companies, and perhaps put them into temporary work, but also reskilling them in a different sector.
Very true. A twofold question here. You mentioned that perhaps we need to look at multinationals implementing some of these policies for their investment strategies here in South Africa. With the capital flight that's been taking place, are we placing too much focus and attention on these multinationals to be our saviors? And secondly, how do we get it right? And maybe it starts with the policy perspective, and even capital providing incentives to young and junior miners or processing companies, or those who want to use tailings from some of these operations to cultivate that environment of a small businesses and enterprises which thrive in the mining sector off of the back of these additional services that could be rendered. Are we not looking at it in that comprehensive manner?
Yeah, yes.
We have to.
But have we done enough of that yet? Or is the implementation lacking?
We haven't done enough of it. And I often argue that it cannot always be the responsibility. Remember, it's not a mining company, multinationals company's responsibility to deliver basic services to a community.
True.
But it is the local municipality, through local government, responsibility to deliver that services. And what I often argue is that there should be a public-private partnership there, because, for example, the local government can come, give out basic services such as water, housing, roads, healthcare, and so forth. And the mining companies or the multinational can come to augment on that. It is not solely, and that's why we go missing, we veer off the road as South Africa. It is not solely the responsibility of a mining company to develop the community it is hosting. And that is why we have seen the level of service delivery protest increase in South Africa, because communities in frustration of not getting basic services from their governments will take it to the door of the mining company that operates within their area. So government, local municipalities must play a crucial role, must be held accountable in terms of delivering local services to mine hosting municipalities. Then companies can come and add on to what is already being done.
And from a regulatory perspective, you do really need a firm regulation framework for that. As it currently stands, especially in the South African context, the regime relating to beneficiation is still very high level, not setting out clear details, and part of even that draft framework is caught up on the long outstanding MPRDA amendment provisions. So even if MPRDA bill were to be enacted tomorrow and put into implementation, you're still having a gap because you don't have the regulations or detailed provisions regarding how it should be done and the different role players' obligations, rights and duties in respect of that regime. So from a regulatory perspective, you do need, especially from a beneficiation point of view, that we go a little bit further to define what exactly do we want out of it, and whether then we have the entire, as a concept, it's welcomed, but we need to just proceed and fine-tune our regulations and in order to be
and to implement them.
Implement it.
Very true. Surely this is where you see these examples working in other countries like Botswana. Yeah. Can't we lend from their hymn book and implement here?
I think, from our side, from a financial services point of view, we've seen as well, if it's brownfields or greenfields, in any one of the two, we've seen, obviously if companies have been well established, we've seen up to today still, companies would come to us asking us for assistance to put up housing project schemes, etc., or maybe assisting, with their workers getting either a home loan, things like that. We've seen subsidies and, funding schemes happening in our environment as well. We've seen, especially up into Africa, though, that if a company starts with a greenfields operation and it's a new mine and they still have to put the electricity, or they have to do the foundation work, etc., that immediately funding for housing, electricity and water for communities, as well as for their labor working in their mines, is actually happening at the same time. So when we put funding proposals in place for many of the African operations, that becomes a phase 2, because clearly the mine have to start operating and be established first before, that happens. So we've seen in tandem happening, those two aspects. And it can work perfectly. But I mean, to put a house down and then all the, the community work that must actually happen from a municipality point of view becomes a different story. So I do think it's not just, it's a tripartite arrangement when it comes to certain funding.
Very true. Coming back to the demands, and just to wrap up, as we still focus on labor slightly, the outlook, Mamokgethi, for 2017. We've seen AMCU certainly showing its weight in the platinum sector, and we saw the lead up and the losses that were made significantly in 2015, but in the gold sector as well. There's something bubbling under there. Just recently, in the month of January, Harmony Gold had a sit-in of several of its workers, and I understand led by AMCU members. Is AMCU a potential threat to the South African mining fraternity?
In the labor context of South Africa, one will always have to look at it in the fact that labor's roots has always been a language of protest, but also has always been a part of changing the narrative or the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. So of course, labor will always be perceived as militant, as combatant in the mining industry. And but perhaps in moving forward in 2017, I do not anticipate many changes to happen mostly because wage negotiations of the industry sectors are concluded. The gold sector concluded its negotiation the year before. The platinum sector concluded its negotiations last year. What is perhaps changing for me in terms of the work that I do in labor and when I engage labor, when I engage union, is that we are seeing a fragmentation of labor. And by that I mean where we once used to have one powerful organized labor, we are now beginning to see upshoots and fragmentation of it. And within that, because they are now becoming many, we are going to see a contestation for leadership, in a sense of they would want to be the dominant one in the industry. So AMCU, we have seen, has taken over the platinum sector. It is the biggest union in the platinum sector. And news on the ground when you engage workers of all unions at different minds is that we are seeing a future where perhaps AMCU has made roads into the gold sector, and we will probably depose NUM as the biggest union in the gold sector, because you have seen at the last CEC, NUM and Congress, the number of its membership has declined. And therefore, in union language, the more number you have of members, the more powerful you become. But perhaps another player that is going to be significant is Irvin Jim and his United Workers movement, if they are going to come through, because he is no longer, or NUMSA is no longer bound by the principle of COSATU that says one union, one industry, or one sector. Now we might see NUMSA, the country's biggest union, expanding into mining sector, in the mining industry, in all sectors of it. And that might mean interesting times for your clients who are in the mining industry, because they will have to deal with a very vocal, very militant, very clear on what it wants, a union in the name of NUMSA.
This worries me slightly, and I don't want it to take away from the optimism with which we started this conversation on the outlook for 2017, which is slightly more positive. But how do you tie in all these various elements, when it be labor and the different shoots and groupings of individuals who have different voices and different forms and becoming more militant, and at the same time wanting to upskill, include these individuals in a world where technology also plays a big threat? I think it was just over 2 or 3 or 4 years ago where, again, mechanization was a huge theme at the Mining Indaba. Are we expecting that again to be at the table this year?
If I can maybe just answer that point, I do think all relevant parties, and it's a big ecosystem that we actually work with, it's very important that we are all very responsible. Because if all of our objectives are for economic growth, democracy, labor, peace, you know, for everyone to move forward, you know, in our country and also into Africa, I think that for me is where our leaders, and it doesn't matter if you're leader of a company, leader of a political party, leader of a union, if you are irresponsible in the way that you deal with many of these aspects, that is going to be detrimental to the country that you operate in, and we cannot have that. If you talk about mechanization, I've got a firm view on mechanization, and it's a personal view. If all of these things that I've mentioned is not managed appropriately, what companies will have to do is move to mechanization, because it's cheap, it's robots, it's things happening, and for me, is for everyone to make sure that we benefit from all of this is let's be responsible and make sure that there is place for labor, there is place for machines, there's place for, you know, for everything. For me, I've got a firm view on mechanization, and I think our leaders should recognize, you know, the impact of what it will have if we don't do the management appropriately.
Indeed, mechanization has a place as well, especially from mine health and safety. There have been instances whereby it is shown that it is much safer to go mechanization way, especially if you're working in far deeper levels of mines. Therefore, it's got inherent value. So it cannot be discarded. And we have seen, if you see from some of these international researchers, they do anticipate that mechanization is still going to be a debate, and it's going to be one of the key trends to watch in the years to come.
On that note, though, as we start to wrap up the conversation over the next 6 minutes, I want us to get your views on the conversations that each of you will be keen to participate in at the Mining Indaba this year, and more importantly, the takeaways that we can implement and reap rewards from, hopefully, within the next 5, 10, but then again, mining is a long-term investment, so maybe even the next 50, 30 years. Let's start off with you, Shirley. The conversations you'll be participating in and fruitful outcomes that you hope to achieve.
We hope to have many discussions with many clients in various countries as well, maybe understanding from their point of view the relationship they have with the governments and the political environments that they operate in, so that we also can form a view of investing in those various African countries.
So far, which areas in the continent have proved to be very fruitful?
So we've seen, I think, if you look at mining and metals and you look at oil and gas, there's a bit of a difference. But we've seen definitely in the gold space, we've seen West Africa happening quite substantially. Obviously, if you move down then on the copper side, Zambia has been, quite good in the way that they've planned, and I'm talking about the companies, the way that they've planned their expansion. So we believe it's just to get closer to those environments, to make sure as well that our existing investments, as well as future investments, that we are completely okay with that as well.
Wandisile, lots of loose ends from a regulatory perspective, but fruitful outcomes you're looking to achieve?
Fruitful outcomes is dispute resolution and dispute management would be key. We've started to see trends regarding, class actions. That's the term I'm looking for. We've seen a trend towards class actions, and recognizing that there's a way of resolving disputes before they get there.
Is that because there's still a trust deficit between some of these participants and stakeholders?
There seems to be some trust deficit, but I think that gap is not widening, it's coming closer. What tends to sometimes widen is what Mamkhet mentioned, when there's contestation on the ground between unions, then each wanting to deliver the result. So that's why, at the Mining Indaba, one of the key things that I'll really be participating in is in those discussions relating to mediation and arbitration of disputes, and to that end, as the firm is also hosting a seminar on day 1 of the Mining Indaba on that subject. And part, again, concrete outcome with clear timelines that one hopes this time around will be honored, because even last year we promised the same, that regulatory certainty is key priority, and that was a very welcome message. But we hope that this time around we do get to have that long promised regulatory certainty, and as we have indicated already, there will still be gaps, but it would help if we close the ones that we already have identified, and then we start a separate process.
I always engage issues on policies at the Mining Indaba, because I deal a lot with policy framework, legislature, and also probably I'll get crisis sessions about dispute resolution, because that is mostly part of one of the key things that I do. But significant perhaps for me will be to look at a positive outlook in terms of how social and labor planning of mining companies, breakaway sessions that are going to be around social and labor planning of mining companies, what have they learned and what can we take from there, but also what are they going to do differently throughout the continent, by the way, because it's not just about South Africa. When you look at Central African Republic, when you look at the DRC, when you look at the other Congo, what have they done in terms of social and labor responsibility, and what key significant message is coming out, or what key lessons has come out of it, and if those lessons can be taken, duplicated or replicated and be implementable, because lessons for me in the mining industry are critical if one can take from another sector, implement it in another, and still manage to get results. But above all, for me, that is significant is to engage on issues again on issues of employee relations. That's the aspect, because I work within the labor context of mining, so issues of employee relations, issues of employee scheme beneficiations, and equally so issues of dispute resolutions, because again one sits in different kinds of wage negotiations in the mine sector.
Before we wrap up, I want to get a sense of you mentioned learning some examples from some of our colleagues across the continent and perhaps implementing some of those solutions here. How open is the relationship between South African executives, South African government, South African funders with our peers on the rest of the continent? Are we as united a front as we present ourselves at the Mining Indaba behind closed doors?
I attend many of the mining conferences across Africa, and I do present there as well. And I've seen on 80% of my attendances in a Uganda conference or a Kenya conference or a Botswana conference, our South African government counterparts are definitely there. So I do think there's a very close relationship, with the various countries. And I do think everyone can learn lessons from each other. So I think on beneficiation, I think Botswana, for example, has done very well there. We've got a few lessons to learn from there. And so there are many examples.
Exactly, being open and honest about the achievements and shortcomings that we have across the board. I'm happy to hear that none of you mentioned Trump will be on the agenda, so you won't be watching his tweets whilst you're at the convention center in Cape Town. We'll leave it there for today, but thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. While clearly getting a distinct understanding of the positive outlook that we have for the resources space across the African continent, looking at policy certainty and ensuring that we do manage to close up the gaps that have been noted, looking at our relationship with labor as well as several other stakeholders and the human element across the board when it comes to the resources environment, and of course dispute resolution. Conflict will always be there, but it's how we come over those challenges that certainly sets the path and trajectory going forward. Well, those are some of the insights from my guests, and again a big thank you to each of them for participating today. Shirley Weber, coverage head of natural resources at Barclays Africa; Wandisile Manglana, partner for mining and environmental affairs, environmental law, at Bowman's; and Mamokgeti Malopiane, mining and labor analyst at Creative Voodoo Consulting. For myself and the team, we'll leave it here for today. It's goodbye for now.